All right, Sam. So the 2022 NFL draft has officially come and gone. The dust is settled now a little bit. Now that we have a chance to take a few breaths, I want to take a closer look at the NFC North division as a whole. After, a wild and wacky draft weekend that included something you never see, which was division teams wheeling and dealing with one another. And I'm not talking about just, a day 3, 6-round conditional pick for a backup special teamer. I'm talking major moves by Kwesi with the Lions and the Packers, as we saw. So now that we've had a chance to collect ourselves here, we heard from Kwesi himself about things like, the fact that just because we don't do that trade doesn't mean the Lions could move right up to 13 and grab Jamison Williams anyway. So why handcuff ourselves and limit our trading partners by 3 just because they're in our division? Some good points were made. But at the end of the day, Sam, it wasn't trading inside the division that I think fans had a problem with so much, in my opinion. It was they felt that Kwesi got swindled. He just didn't get the value on that trade back, plain and simple. And I think after being able to re-examine it further now, and maybe it doesn't seem quite as bad for people from a value standpoint when you consider this draft specifically was very deep in rounds 2, 3, and 4, something that things like that Rich Hill trade chart that we've been using for years just doesn't take into consideration. So real quick, what was your overall first impression of those moves Kwesi made? And did you think he did a good enough job justifying it to fans afterwards in the press conference? Or will that move always be something we look back on and scratch our heads?
I think that the ends, you don't necessarily have to justify the means. So look who the Vikings came away with. At the end of day 2, they've got an undersized linebacker. They've got a guard. They've got a safety. They've got a corner. Those are good players, but they're not really attractive players to the common fan.
Right.
When you have teams trading up with you to get Jamison Williams and Christian Watson, I would argue that wide receiver is maybe the second most important position in football right now, with as good as these quarterbacks are and how wide receivers can change your team. Those players undoubtedly make the Packers and Lions better, gives them upside. And certainly with the Packers, they had a serious weakness at wide receiver. And they go out and get a guy that's going to help Aaron Rodgers tremendously. Jamison Williams probably doesn't hurt you too much this year with the injury, but once the Lions get a quarterback in place, that could be someone that haunts you. All that said, you can't totally control who the team you trade with picks. That is part of the risk of the trade, is that you are passing up on players, making them available to other teams so that you can get more players. Basically, you can have quantity. The Vikings come away with players that I think will help them down the road, maybe this year a little bit, but not players that are moving the needle necessarily from a fan standpoint. Brian Asamoah, I think fans are like, well, we took Troy Dye and we took Chaz Surratt. How is this any different? They see a guard taken and they say, well, this guy has legal issues in the past and we already have 5 other guards to compete. So how is this different? I think that what the Vikings got to what the Lions and Packers got didn't really add up. And that's why the fans are upset. Did Kwesi, kind of explain it pretty well to say, hey, they can trade with other teams, we're not the only fish in the sea. Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. And hey, I think Arif made this point on Twitter, our friend Arif Hassan. If you feel like you're winning the trade based on your trade chart, and it seems like the Vikings were winning based on the modern charts, don't you want to swindle a division rival? That's another way to look at it too. So I can see both sides of it, but I totally understand why the fans are upset when you see your rivals taking great franchise-changing players potentially, and then the Vikings, get players that aren't immediately that appealing.
Yeah, it's a good point there, too. I mean, I think the trade philosophy and mentality has to stay the same, whether it's an in-division team or any other team. It's just the risk-reward becomes a double whammy, right? Either if you hit, you just swindled your division rival. That feels twice as good. If you miss, dang, now I got to go line up against this guy in my division the next 5-10 years, twice a year. So I think just the magnitude certainly amplifies a little bit there. But before we get into maybe some specific guys, you know who they got? Lions and Packers, both with 2 first-round picks. Lions with the number 2 and number 13 pick. Bears didn't pick until 39. Of course, they gave away their first-round pick for Justin Fields last year. Just recapping and analyzing the jobs these NFC North teams did, who or what really sticks out for you?
Yeah, I think the Lions probably came out best, and that makes sense. They had 2 picks in the top 12. Vikings gave them one of those picks, but they walk away with, the number 2 edge. They walk away with another outstanding defensive lineman in Josh Pascal. So their trenches, man, are getting good. I mean, their offensive and defensive lines were probably the strength of their team already, and that defensive line got much better. Jamison Williams can be a dynamic offensive player down the road once he gets healthy, and Kirby Joseph too on day 2, a pretty good safety out of Illinois. I know they didn't have a 4th-round pick, but what they did through the first 2 days, probably the best in the division. And then it's kind of hard not to put the Vikings number 2. I know the Packers had a couple first-round picks, but people aren't thrilled with what the Packers did getting Devontae Wyatt. I think people question that. And they took a guard, right? It was a guard, and it was Devontae Wyatt in the first round. So, and the guard that they got was in the 3rd round. That's what I was thinking of. So,
yes. Yep.
But the Packers do come away with Watson. I think the Vikings haul of Scene and Booth probably puts them a little bit above. And then the Bears without a first-round pick, I think you got to put them at the bottom. It's just hard to really have an impact draft without that first-round pick, even though Kyler Gordon is a nice prospect. I think the Vikings and Lions probably came out best long term. Like I said, hard to know what these guys will do for the Vikings in year 1. Maybe some sub-package looks with Scene and Booth, but we don't know if they're going to be starters, Luke, and that's okay. That's okay. If you amass talent that can be effective for your team down the road, that's what's ultimately important.
Yeah, we just don't know, like you mentioned it. That's why it's so fun. We come back 3-4 years from now, we see how this whole thing shakes out and just how big of an impact and ripple effect this draft, Kwesi's first draft class and moves as a GM, has on the team and the rest of the division. So it's going to be a lot of fun.